Everyone to our Bible study tonight. We're starting a new book. We just spent about 14 months in the book of Isaiah, and I think we understand Isaiah quite well. But tonight we're going to start another book. Ezekiel is considered one of the major prophets. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. The thing about the relationship between all of these prophets is Isaiah lived about 100 years before Ezekiel and Daniel. And so what we just considered was about 100 years before. Jerusalem had not been put into captivity yet. And but now, in Ezekiel, we're seeing that Jerusalem has been taken into captivity, and God inspired the prophet Ezekiel, to encourage his people, to warn his people, and Ezekiel was right there living amongst the captives. At the same time that Ezekiel was living, Daniel was living as a prophet in the royal house in Babylon. And we talked about this yesterday. Daniel probably never knew Ezekiel. But it's clear that Ezekiel knew Daniel, because he mentions Daniel by name, I think, at least 3 times in his book. So trying to connect the dots and trying to put all these Bible characters together, it gives us a broader understanding as we study. But we're going to begin with a word of prayer, and I'm going to call on Brother Dennis, if he'll pray for us tonight.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for joining us all together here tonight. We look forward to hearing your word and to understanding it. For we all need to understand the word, because we have to live by it. And we ask all these things in His name.
Right, if you have your Bible open, look right there, chapter 1. As an introduction to Ezekiel, let's read the first 3 verses. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. If one of you would like to read it, then you can.
In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kabar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of the king Jehoiakim. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Uzziah, by the Kabar River, in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was upon him.
Okay, and you may have noticed that verse 1 was written in the first person. Okay, you see that in the beginning? It came to pass in the 30th year, as I was among the captives. This was first person, like in an autobiographical way. He says, I was among the captives, and then he says, I saw this. But then in verses 2 or 3, it was written in the third person. Ezekiel is spoken of as if he is someone other than the writer. These 2 verses are the only ones in the book that are not written in the first person. The whole book is written in the first person as a man who experienced and saw the things that he wrote down. But these 2 verses, 2 and 3, are an exception. Anybody have a suggestion of what that might be? Well, what it is probably there was a scribe who edited Ezekiel's writing. And he added some things here that gave us some more understanding of who Ezekiel was. And I'm grateful that he did, because there would be a lot of unknown knowledge as to who Ezekiel was had he not added this. If you admit those 2 verses, you will see that verse 1 would flow naturally to verse 4. Look at the end of verse 1. That the heavens were opened and I saw the visions of God. And then someone read verse 4.
And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself, and brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof as the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire.
You see that? 2 and 3 was added by a scribe. And the Holy Spirit allowed that to happen, thank God. Without verses 2 and 3, we would have a smooth flow. But we would have missed out a lot of detail on who Ezekiel was. Like it says in the 30th year, but it didn't say in the 30th year of what, did it? It didn't say that. But it doesn't say what. We are left to guess how the 30th year reckoned. It says in the 5th day of the month, which verse 2 says was the 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. Again, the scribe gave us some extra detail. The 5th year was the same time as the 30th year of something. Now, there had been a reasonable explanation that the 30th year was other than it may have been the 30th year of the prophet's life. That seems to be the general consensus of those who study Ezekiel. It is the only date in the book that's not associated with any known event. Therefore, it must be a reference of his own age when he entered into the ministry. We see his name in verse 3. We also see his father's name, Uzi. We also see that he was a priest. That means he was of the lineage of Aaron and of the tribe of Levi. As a priest, at the age of 30, he would begin his priestly functions in the temple of Jerusalem, but he wasn't in the temple of Jerusalem. He was by the river Kibar, which was the major canal of the river Euphrates that connected with the Tigris River, and it was used as a commerce, as a major canal. It was somewhere probably southwest of the city of Babylon. So he was one of the captives in Babylon, probably about 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem at this time. The time is associated, as it said, with Jehoiachin's captivity. Now, there were 3 deportations into Babylon. Isaiah and Jeremiah specifically prophesied that the Jews would go into captivity. Jeremiah said that the captivity would be 70 years in duration. That captivity would come in 3 deportations. The first deportation was in 605 BC. Then was when Nebuchadnezzar, who was not yet king of Babylon, but he at that time was a general of the armies. His father was the king. Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem. He took many of his chief citizens away, among whom was probably the most well known to us, Daniel, and the 3 Hebrews whom we studied in the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel was written by another prophet who was captive in Babylon. Then 8 years later, in 597, remember the years went backwards then, there was another deportation. It was a general deportation. 10,000 Jews were deported. And Jehoiachin, the king of Jerusalem, was taken himself, and that was when Ezekiel was taken. So Ezekiel was taken into captivity 8 years after Daniel was. He was either Daniel's age or he could have been a little older. Daniel, of course, as we know, was a boy at the time he went into captivity. Ezekiel went in with the 10,000 others along with King Jehoiakim himself. And again, King Jehoiachin was the king of Jerusalem at that time. Now, the rest of all of this that I just described, if you want to read it, is in the book of Kings. 2 Kings chapter 24. But then, 11 years later, Nebuchadnezzar came back and he burned Jerusalem. What happened with those 11 years between? Well, Jehoiachin was taken into captivity. In 597, Nebuchadnezzar set up Jehoiachin's uncle, Zedekiah, to be the king of Jerusalem in his place. Later, Zedekiah rebelled. He sought aid from Egypt to rebel against Babylon, and that is why in 586 Nebuchadnezzar came back and damaged Jerusalem. This was all because of Zedekiah's rebellion. And at that point, almost everyone was deported from Jerusalem. The city was destroyed, and most of the others were deported. And then Nebuchadnezzar set up Gedaliah to be governor over Jerusalem, but Gedaliah was assassinated by his own people, after which they fled to Egypt, taking Jeremiah forcibly with them because they knew retaliation would come from Babylon. So there were 3 deportations. First took the noble citizens, including Daniel, in 605. The second, they took the king Jehoiachin, 10,000, and Ezekiel in 597. And then 11 years later came the destruction of Jerusalem. This is being stressed because knowing this or having an idea of it helps us to appreciate more Ezekiel's prophetic word. He apparently was 25 years old when he was taken into captivity. We understand this was for the facts that he was 30 years old in the 5th year of that captivity. So Ezekiel spent 5 years as an exile in Babylon before he got the call by God to be a prophet. In the 5th year of this, he was called, and 6 years after that, Jerusalem was destroyed. Half of the book of Ezekiel, the first 24 chapters, are prophecies uttered by the prophet in the first 6 years of his ministry until the fall of Jerusalem. It's obvious because of the time when Ezekiel lived, Ezekiel would have known Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem before Ezekiel was taken into exile, and even beyond that point. Now, Jeremiah would have been much older than Ezekiel. He would have had ample opportunity, Ezekiel would have, to hear Jeremiah's message. Both of them spoke against the false prophets. They both had prophecies that fall and the lengthy exile that would undergo was stressed. He lived at the time of Daniel, but as I said in the introduction, he probably never met Daniel. He lived in different parts of the Babylonian Empire. Ezekiel apparently lived with the captives in Tel Aviv, which was south and west of the city of Babylon. On the other hand, Daniel lived right there in Babylon. He received honors and became like the prime minister of Babylon. Ezekiel lived with the captives, and he never had any political power. Daniel and Ezekiel lived in Babylon. Daniel, of course, as I said, lived in Babylon at the same time that Ezekiel lived with captives. He lived in the palace, Ezekiel with the captives. Ezekiel probably knew about Daniel, but I just said they never met. Ezekiel mentions Daniel twice in his book, and he speaks of him highly. Daniel had a good reputation among the captives, and perhaps they hoped that this high position that this Hebrew would have in the palace would help bring their restoration sooner or quicker. But we know that when God puts a judgment on something, you have to fulfill that judgment. Now, in Ezekiel chapter 14, I'm trying to begin chapter 1, and I'm trying to give you an introduction of this. And so that's why I'm kind of being wordy right now. But let's look at something as we're introducing this book. In Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14. Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14. Notice what Ezekiel says.
You got to read it. Even these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it. They could save only themselves by their righteousness, declares the sovereign Lord.
Now, I'm not going to go into the context of why Ezekiel mentioned these 3 names, but I'm making a point. Note that Daniel and Noah and Job are mentioned. Now, Daniel, who at this time would have been in Babylon for about 15 years, and he attained a very high status that he could be compared. Notice who he was compared with. the ancient righteous men that stood out of those Jewish generations. Don't you think the Jews knew who Noah was? And of course, they knew who Job was. Right? Here you got a man who's only been in Babylon for 15 years. And notice how Ezekiel he inserts that man into these great men of faith and righteousness. He puts, usually people aren't canonized until after they're dead. But this man was still alive. The Jews would kill their prophets, and later generations would admire the prophets that their fathers had killed. But here we had two men from the ancient past, Job and Noah, and a contemporary person living, and Daniel was set in the same ranks with these two men. This really shows the high honor that was placed on Daniel among his Jewish contemporaries, for Ezekiel to put him with those men. Ezekiel lived among the captives, as I said, in Tel Aviv. And reading this, we get a picture of the kind of life that the Jews had during their captivity in Babylon. Now, let me say this. This was nowhere near as rigorous or difficult as their captivity that they had in Egypt. When they were in Egypt, what were they? Slaves. In Egypt, they were out to be forced labor, hard labor. Taskmasters would beat and kill them. Whereas these Jews that lived in Tel Aviv had their own homes. They had a certain amount of freedom because Ezekiel was able to wander about by the river Kibar. He would have visions and come back home, and the elders of Israel would resort to Ezekiel's house to inquire of the Lord. What is the Lord saying? They admired him. They looked up to him, and they came to his home to receive words from the Lord. This shows us that during the Babylonian captivity, the Jews were allowed to have some kind of social structure, and it involved elders, which are recognized leaders of their community. They had a certain amount of liberty, far more than they had in Egypt. Though it was not good enough for them, in Psalm 137, it was very clear that they were very galled by their captivity. To be removed from Zion in Jerusalem was something that was hard for them. It was a hard pill for them to swallow. You can read Psalm 137 to get the attitude of the Jews. In fact, turn there. This is a stanza that was written by one of the Jews who was in captivity. Notice their attitude about being away from Jerusalem. Psalm 137. If one of you men would read 1 through 6. 137, 1 through 6.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our hearts upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there did they carry us away captive, required of us a song. And they that wasted us required us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her fame. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my feet, yours. Remember, O Lord, the children of youth, in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, even to the foundation thereof.
So this is the way that the Jews felt while they were captive in Babylon. They longed to be home in Jerusalem. However, the situation in Babylon was not anywhere as bad as it had been in Egypt. So the elders of Tel Aviv would come to Ezekiel's house to inquire of the Lord. And just because they did that did not mean they were godly men. In most cases, Ezekiel would have a nasty word for them. And God said to them, Why would these men inquire of me when they set idols in their hearts? While the Jews would be in captivity, they would send the prophets for their idolatry, which they practiced home in Jerusalem. But when they were in Babylon, strangely, they did not practice idolatry. That is one thing that cured them during their captivity. They had idols in Jerusalem, but when God put them in captivity, they finally stopped. God points out to Ezekiel that though they were not adversely worshiping idols in Babylon, they were still entertaining idols in their hearts. God still had a hard word for them. In fact, flip over to Ezekiel 33. It's very clear that even though the people were coming to him to hear a word from the Lord, they actually had no inclination at all to obey the word of the Lord. Justin, when you read 30 through 33. Ezekiel 33, beginning with verse 30.
As for you, son of man, your countrymen are talking together about you by the walls and at the doors of the houses, saying to each other, "Come and hear the message that has come from the Lord." My people come to you as they usually do, and sit before you to listen to your words, but they do not put them into practice. With their mouths they express devotion, but their hearts are greedy for an unjust king. Indeed, to them you are nothing more than one who sings love songs with a beautiful voice and plays an instrument well, where they hear your words but do not put them into practice. When all this comes true, and it surely will, then they will know that a prophet has been among them.
So the people would come to listen, but God says they only do it for the entertainment. Here they were captive, so coming to hear what the Lord said from Ezekiel, it was kind of like they were breaking from their boredom. It's like listening to a man play a lovely song on an instrument, but you're only going for the entertainment. You're not really, it might not even be the type of music you like, but it's better than sitting home doing nothing, right? You go to serve yourself. The people were coming to Ezekiel out of curiosity and a desire to know what God would say next. But there was really no desire to do the will of God. Do we see that in the church today? People want to hear what the pastor has to say. Oh, they'll go up and in some churches they'll have a prophetic word and they want to know what's the Lord want, what's going on with them. They want to know, hey, let me know. People come to the altar every week. But when they hear the expressed will of the Lord through the sermons, it goes right over their heads. I want you to pray for me, Pastor. You want me to pray? Okay. I pray. But yet during the message, you're not paying attention to what God might be saying to you through the Word. I'm not saying I'm God, but if I'm in the Holy Spirit, the Word, there might be something I say that God directed to the individual. You talk to God and He talks back to you. There's different ways that He does that. People want to know what God has to say over my life, unless you tell them that a judgment's coming, and then they run. They want. There you go. Very good. That's true. Even though these elders came to hear from the Lord, they didn't come to do the will of the Lord. That was the reason they were in captivity to begin with. You see, it seems like they would learn a little something by now, wouldn't they? There were among the exiles in Babylon false prophets. Ezekiel and Jeremiah spoke against them. Those false prophets were saying that they would not continue to be punished and that they would soon be released. This whole ordeal would soon be past and God would still on their side and they would not settle in Babylon at all but be ready for the release to go back. Do you remember how Jeremiah had written letters to those exiles. He was still in Jerusalem. He wrote to them and he told them to go ahead and settle in, cultivate the land, establish homes, get settled. They were going to be there for a long time. Jeremiah told them 70 years. Now, in our previous studies, do you remember why it was 70 years? You know, every 7 years, the Israelites were supposed to have a Sabbath year. They were to give their land rest. They weren't to cultivate their land. They let the land rest. So the 5th year and the 6th year, they had to really cultivate more and save it so that their next 7th year they would still have food because their land would rest. You know how many Sabbaths they missed with land rest? Take a wild guess. 70. That was in the law. 70 Sabbath years they failed to recognize because of their greed and because of not wanting to have to do extra work to set aside for it. Yeah. Isn't that something? That was, now, in addition to that, there were other things that they were doing too, idolatry and many other things. So their punishment, even though from what we've just established, their punishment was not really that severe as it was in Egypt. They didn't get that severe punishment. Maybe they should have had some more severe punishment. I'm not correcting God, because only God knows what's really needed. But the point is they still they didn't seem to get it. Jeremiah told them, you're going to be there for a long time. No, you're not going to get there, and 2 or 3 years later, Jerusalem's going to be restored. That's what they were hoping. And it did not happen that way. Chapters 1 to 24, the first half was uttered before Jerusalem fell, and they almost all depict the future of the overthrow of Jerusalem. Jeremiah's word was the opposite of the false prophets because he was prophesying doom, while others, the false prophets, were prophesying restoration. Uh-oh, that sounds familiar. We live in a time where Jesus told us to seek first His kingdom, to live simple, to not be part of the world, to separate ourselves, to not store up treasures here on earth where moths and dust consume and thieves break in and steal, right? But then we have other preachers whose preaching is now's the time to get rich and be rich and have it all. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Unfortunately, for the ones that might be preaching, it's time to get rich. I'm going to listen to Jesus before I listen to you. But as I said, the same thing was happening in Jeremiah and Ezekiel's day. False prophets were prophesying, you're going to go back to Jerusalem. In fact, you're going to have a bigger house than you had before you left. And we're going to rebuild that temple, and it's going to be twice as big as it was before we left. You see, the false prophets and the false preachers preach what people want to hear, not what they need to hear. It was about 6 years period from the time he began to prophesy to the time that Jerusalem fell. Now here's an interesting thought some of you may not have considered. Ezekiel had a wife, and in the 9th year of his captivity, which would be when he was 34 years old, his wife died. This was not an accident. This was apparently an act of God. It coincided with the besieging of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar for the final siege that would lead to its destruction. The death of Ezekiel's wife was a symbolism of the death of Jerusalem. Remember how Hosea had to marry a prostitute to symbolize that Israel had poured herself with the nations? Remember that? Ezekiel's wife would die as a symbolism of the death of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, who was God's wife. God told Ezekiel not to mourn. Why he was told that, it's not entirely clear. People have different opinions, but it apparently has to do with the fact that God was not going to mourn Jerusalem. She was not worthy enough to be mourned. Many of the destruction that would come upon her, many of the marriages of the prophets were affected by their call. Remember Isaiah? We just studied him. He was married to a prophetess, and she bore him 2 children, and both of those children had names that were symbolic of his ministry. Their birth were signs to Israel. Jeremiah was told by God not to get married, stay single. Ezekiel dealt with the death of his wife, and it was a sign. As I said, Hosea had to marry a woman who would be unfaithful to him so that his marriage would relate to the relationship between God and his people. So many times, the person's marital condition was something God was using in the prophet's call. The prophet's call was a part of every part of his life. He wouldn't just prepare a sermon and preach it and then go do what he wanted to do. I don't know, this is Sunday. I don't have to worry about nothing until Wednesday or Thursday night. It wasn't that way. The message that the prophet had, it was burning in him. And his message affected every aspect of his life. It affected his wife. It affected his children. You can tell that Ezekiel was affected by his message. As we study this, you'll see it. And it affected him in every part of his life. The prophecies of Ezekiel are dated, and they are dated from the year that Jehoiachin went into captivity. These prophecies cover a span of at least 22 years. The last dated prophecy is mentioned in Ezekiel 29, verse 17, and that date is the 27th year of his captivity. This would have been 22 years after the call of being a prophet, and if he was 30 years old when he was called, then Ezekiel would be about 52 years old. He may have given prophecy after that, but we don't know. It's not recorded for us. But we do know for sure that as a prophet, Ezekiel had at minimum 22 years of ministry. There's much about Ezekiel's ministry that is difficult to understand. My opinion is that Ezekiel is the most difficult book in the Old Testament. Now, you know in the New Testament what's probably the most difficult book? Revelation. But guess what? If you study with us in Revelation, you're going to find out that Ezekiel and Revelation have a lot in common. The book of Ezekiel is commented or alluded to a lot in the New Testament. There's at least 65 times in the New Testament that it's alluded to. 48 of those 65 times is in the book of Revelation alone. Since Revelation only has 22 chapters, you can see that there are on average at least two allusions of Ezekiel in every chapter of the book of Revelation. To understand Revelation, we would expect an understanding of Ezekiel to be helpful as a prerequisite. Now, there are scores of books about Revelation. Very few of the authors of Revelation have books on Ezekiel. It's difficult to find any good books on Ezekiel because it is such an exhaustive and difficult book. Even the better scholars seem to be at loss to explain certain things in the book of Ezekiel. Now, we have to realize that much of Ezekiel's prophecies were acted out. Now, we're at a disadvantage because when you act something, you're not reading it, you're what? You're seeing it. You're acting it out. Well, we're at a disadvantage here because we're not sitting here watching Ezekiel do it. There is, in many cases, a description of what he did. But sometimes these descriptions in Ezekiel are not complete enough to fully understand it. When it said he laid on his side for 390 days, did that mean 24 hours a day for 390 days? Or did he just do it the 390 days while he was sleeping? We're not told that. We don't understand that. Or did it mean that certain hours of the day he went out in public and lay on his side? This was done to depict something. We're not told. If we would have been there, we would have seen how this was carried out. I can't imagine any human being being able to lay on their side and not get up for 390 days. And be able to get up after laying there that long. Your hip would be so wore out, it'd be so sore you wouldn't be able to walk. The same is true about the special food he had to eat. Was that the only thing he ate? Or did he eat it, or he only ate it publicly? If you read the 4th and 5th chapter, you will know what I'm talking about here. We're going to get there. This is often the case. When Ezekiel's told to carry out something, we're given the sketchiest details of what he did. His contemporaries would have had the advantage to actually seeing him do it. Therefore, his prophecies are more intelligible to them than they are to us. We are left of some gaping holes of knowledge of what he did and what is the meaning there and what it was for. There was at least one time that Ezekiel was transferred in the body or out of the body. He was transported from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The Lord picked him up by the hair and took him into Jerusalem. He dug through the walls. Whether this happened in a vision or he went there physically, it's not entirely clear. But some of his prophecies are uttered to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. It doesn't mean that these inhabitants, if everybody there heard them, it didn't say that. Many of the prophets prophesied about foreign nations and never went to those nations. Many of them prophesied so that the ones near them would know what God was doing. The actual nations in mind may have never heard the prophecy. There's 4 visions that Ezekiel had in his book. 4 acted out prophecies plus other kinds of prophecies given. In chapter 1, he saw the vision of God's chariot and throne. And his second vision occupies chapters 8 through 11, and this is where he's transported to Jerusalem, and he sees the abominations of Jerusalem at the end of this vision. He sees the glory of the Lord departing from the house of God. In the third vision, it's found in chapter 37, this is the vision of the dry bones. We know that. We've heard that. This was a picture of the restoration of the captives. And the final vision in the last 9 chapters, chapters 40 to 48, this is the vision of a temple. It's a temple because no one is quite sure which temple it is. It's very lengthy and detailed in its description, as was the tabernacle. There are measurements and so forth, but no one is sure which temple he saw. It does not appear to be the temple that Zerubbabel built after this time. It doesn't appear to be any temple that's ever been built. Many theories have been advanced about which temple this might have been. And we're going to talk about the various theories when we get to these chapters. Those are the 4 visions. The vision in chapter 1 of the glory of the chariot, the throne of God. The second of the abomination of Jerusalem and the departure of the glory of the house of God. The vision of the dry bones and the vision of the temple. This only makes up a portion, though, of the prophecies in Ezekiel. But these are significant, major visions. The way we're going to cover the book of Ezekiel, and I made this decision just in the last week, is topically. I'm not going to go through it. Chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, all the way to the end. We might do 3 chapters consecutive, but there might be some chapters we skip, and then we're going to come back and do those chapters with other chapters later. We're going to stay on the topic. Because if you don't stay on topic, you're on a roller coaster ride, and you gotta, every time you hit the same subject again, you gotta revisit it, and there's going to be so much rabbit trailing we're going to be doing while we're studying. It's going to be easier to stick to the one subject topic, and then do it in the chapters that's there. And then, but by the time we get to the end, we will have considered every book, every chapter in Ezekiel. There's a number of reasons for doing this. It's quite tedious. It's repetitious. Ezekiel's very repetitious. Sometimes I'm a repetitious teacher. And Ezekiel was a repetitious writer. Within a given sentence or verse, he repeats things. You'll find this is just in the first 3 chapters. He'll say something and he'll take it much longer to say it than you would think it needs to take. And he'll repeat certain phrases repeatedly in one sentence, which makes it very strenuous to read. I'm not making fun of anybody who likes this Bible, but have you ever read the Amplified Bible? Okay, it might be good for personal study, but if you're trying to preach from it, you feel like you're saying the same thing 4 times by the time you get to the end of the verse. You know?
If you took that and agree with me, too.
Exactly. Exactly. But this is kind of how Ezekiel was. I'll give you some examples. There were certain phrases that are repeated many, many times in the book. The expression, "they shall have to know that I am the Lord." That expression occurs over 70 times in the book of Ezekiel. There's also the repetition of the phrase "Son of Man." It shows up over 90 times in the book. The key thoughts of what I just mentioned would be that there are the apparent themes of the book. 29 times the statement is made in connection with the coming judgment on Jerusalem. As he describes certain judgments coming upon the city of Jerusalem, he'll interject. "They'll have to know I am the Lord." There's 24 times the statement is made that he's discussing the judgment upon the heathen nations. He interjects. "They're going to have to know that I am the Lord." Then in his prophecies to predict the restoration and the blessings of the Israel of God, that expression occurs 13 times. "They'll have to know that I am the Lord." This tells us that God wants people to know about Him. First, that He is a holy God who punishes sin among His people. 29 times He describes how He is going to punish His people for their sins. "And they shall know that He is the Lord." He's the kind of God who enforces these things. When He mentions this 24 times in conjunction with judging the nations, this shows that He is not just a territorial God, but He's a universal God. Because He's also doing it among the nations. He judges other nations as well. All nations answer to Him, and they shall have to know who He is. Through this, He is Lord, and that He is sovereign over all the world. Then in the prophecies over restoration and blessing, they will know that He is the Lord by His great compassion, by His grace, by His mercy. Though He punishes, He restores while being under no obligation to do so. So the main concern that God expresses throughout this book is that people will know He is the Lord and what type of king that our God is. He makes it very clear. But there are certain repetitions also of themes. In the first 24 chapters about the themes of the destruction of Jerusalem, it comes through different pictorial visions, descriptions, and actions of the prophet. Here is the overall outline of the book. The first 3 chapters give us the opening vision and the call of Ezekiel to be a prophet. Jeremiah describes his call in the first chapter. Isaiah does so in the 6th chapter. Here we have 3 chapters that give us circumstances where Ezekiel is called to a prophetic ministry. Then in chapters 4 through chapter 24, all of which uttered before the fall of Jerusalem predict judgments upon Jerusalem. Predict the fall of Jerusalem. Then 25 to 35, there are prophecies against the heathen nations that come up after Jerusalem's fall. There's no need for a prophet to predict the fall of Jerusalem anymore since it's fallen. And now he turns his attention against the heathen nations that gloat over the fall of Jerusalem. And in the midst of that section, there's two chapters that seem to be out of place. The first one is chapter 33, which repeats other places in the book. And chapter 34, which is a prophecy against the wicked shepherds of Israel. And the prophecy of the coming of the good shepherd, Jesus. Now those two chapters seem to be sandwiched into this section, which talks about the overthrow of the heathen nations. Then chapters 36 to 48, that is the end, we have prophecies about restoration. Restoration of the nation, of the temple, and restoration of worship. Now let's look at chapter 1. We're going to get at verse 4. We're gonna speed through this, and we should be able to end relatively when we're supposed to. Let's look at verse 4. Someone read verse 4.
I looked and I saw a smoke coming out of the north, and in a mixed cloud with flashing lightning, and surrounded by a brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal.
Okay, now this verse tells us that what first caught his attention was something out of ordinary. He had been in captivity for 5 years, and nothing out of ordinary had happened. He did not consider himself to be a prophet. He was to be a priest if he would ever go back to Jerusalem. He couldn't be a priest in Babylon because there was no temple there for a true believer to worship in, so he was just another captive for 5 years. He happened to be out meditating and praying over by the river Kibar. He saw something out of the ordinary in the north. Now, north was symbolically the direction from which judgment came, at least to a Jew's mind. You know why? Because east of the Jew was the Jordan River, and east of that was desert. Was any enemy coming from that direction? West of the Jew was the Mediterranean Sea. Was any enemy coming from that direction? The only one from the south was Egypt. And if they were in good with Egypt, Egypt wasn't coming. So where would the Jews have their enemies coming from which direction? It would come from the north. So it says here in the north that he sees what is a whirlwind. A whirlwind is something, an image of an army coming and sweeping things away, like a tornado. Now we have this imagery used in Daniel chapter 11 and later on in Ezekiel 38 when we talk about God and Magog. In this case, I think it's referring to an army coming. At first it looked like a tornado, but as he looked at it, he saw something within the cloud. There was a sparkling color that was inside this cloud called amber. The word translated amber in Hebrew was a strange word found nowhere else in Hebrew literature. But most translators say it has to do with a metallic kind of color. The Revised Standard Version translates it bronze, but I think it was a metallic color that he sees flashing inside the cloud. And as he's looking at this whirlwind, and he's looking at this thing flashing inside of it, from a distance he couldn't quite make out what it was. It was certainly something that didn't look ordinary. As he got closer, what he saw, a vision of a metallic chariot of God coming with his throne on the chariot. Now this represented God coming to make war. God was coming to judge. Now let's read verses 5 to 14 to describe 4 grotesque beings that supported the chariot upon their wings. Dennis, will you read 5 through 7 and Justin read 10 through 14?
Also, as the midst thereof, in the likeness of 4 living creatures, midst their appearance, they had the likeness of a man, and every one had 4 faces, and every one had 4 wings. And their feet were straight feet, and the sole of their feet was like the soles of ashen foot, and they they sparkled like the color of burnished brass. And they had the hands of the man under their wings on their four sides, and they four had their faces in their wings. Their wings were joined one to another. They turned not when they went. They went every one straight forward.
Their faces looked like this. Each of the four had the face of a man, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of a eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward. Each had two wings, one touching the wing of another creature on either side, and two wings from the body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, or like torches. Fire projected forth among the creatures, whose bright and lightning flashed out of them. The creatures stepped back and forth like flashes of lightning.
And it seems very clear that what he is describing here is something that's really indescribable. Did you get that impression? Because even though he described it, did it really give you a satisfaction of understanding it? You know, you're trying to explain something that's indescribable, it just doesn't click. You don't get a very good, satisfying picture from this description of what it was that he saw. Even if you could somewhat picture it, you can't imagine what in the world it's talking about. One thing that I would like to call to your attention immediately, did you notice that in these segments and these verses that Dennis and Justin just read, how many times the expression "in the likeness of," or "it was like this," or "like that"? Verse 5, the likeness of four living creatures. Likeness of man. Verse 10, likeness of their faces. Verse 13, their appearance was like burning. And it said like the appearance of torches. Verse 14, appearance like a flash of lightning. He was saying that what he saw was like this, or it was like that. It's not that he was saying that when we get to heaven, we're going to see four faces. But this was a depiction or representation of a likeness of something. To support the idea that he didn't see things as they really were, you might recall in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 4, when John was caught up into heaven, he saw four living creatures. Remember that? And they had some resemblance to these four. But there was some differences too. In the case of the living creatures that John saw, they had four faces, but not each of them having four, as was in this case. But in Revelation, each one had one of the four. In Revelation, one had the face of a man, a lion, an ox, an eagle. Here in Ezekiel, each of them have four faces. In the place, the living creatures have four wings. In Revelation, these creatures had 6 wings. Interestingly, in Isaiah chapter 6, the seraphims, they thought they had 6 wings. Revelation seems to show the images from both the seraphims and these creatures, and seem to be the creatures into one being. Now, what should we gather from all of this? Should we assume that there are different kinds of creatures that have all these different faces in heaven? When we do get to heaven and we see everything in the Spirit, that we will see these creatures that Ezekiel saw, plus other creatures that John saw. Or is it possible that what we see when we go to heaven will not be exactly any of this? Remember, when John was called up into heaven, he saw 4 living creatures. But who was in the middle of them? I'll give you a hint. A 4-legged creature. Bah! All right, who was the lamb? Do you think when we get to heaven, we're going to see a lamb sitting on the throne? I don't think so. The lamb was a symbolic representation of Christ. Christ is not a literal lamb. When we see him, we will not see him as a lamb, but we'll see him as he is. The same Christ who ascended with holes in his hands and holes in his feet. John saw symbolic visions of him in Ezekiel seen something that is that of the same character. A symbolic portrayal of spiritual beings. The fact that the images of a man, lion, ox, and eagle is in Ezekiel and John's vision leads me to the conclusion that these are symbolic of certain spiritual ideas or principles that in various visions have been gathered in different forms but reoccur. There's something symbolically valuable about these being a man, a lion, an ox, an eagle in each case. But to say that there are creatures that we will see like this may or may not be the case. I have never ascended into heaven myself, and I can't tell you what it is and what it's not going to be seen there. My understanding is he's talking about the likeness of something. He didn't see the thing itself. He saw something that was like this or like that. Now, this is an assumption I made to begin with the reasons I make for them. Did you have a question?
Did you relate this to what Daniel saw as well in chapter 7?
Yeah. Well, we know Daniel, a lot of what Daniel saw represented world powers, earthly world powers, and we know that Assyria was not really a certain beast, or that Babylon was a certain beast, or that Medes and Persians together were not a certain, we know it all was a symbolism, but yet very true. But we are told certain things about them immediately. There were 4 of them, and it says in verse 5 that they had the likeness of a man. That hardly seems true since we have never met men with 4 faces and 4 wings. Perhaps they had the overall appearance of a man, and they stood upright unlike animals. Maybe that's why it said like a man. In verse 7 it said that their feet were straight feet. Probably the term legs were to be better understood. They had legs shaped like human legs rather than animal legs. They had very divergent peculiarities. The 4 faces have been conjectured about a great deal. Many of the early rabbis believed that the 4 faces represented 4 aspects of the animal kingdom. It was said that the rabbis that the lion was the chiefest and mightiest of the wild animals. The ox was the mightiest of the domesticated animals. The eagle was the mightiest of the birds, and man was the mightiest of them all. Well, the rabbis believed that these 4 faces represented the mightiest of each class of created beings. But that is just a rabbinic teaching. That's not inspired. On this view, it was believed that these living creatures represent the creation or created realm under God. Many Christian scholars take a similar view, that the 4 living creatures in Revelation represent the created realm. I'm not sure I agree with that interpretation. Some early church fathers held the view that these 4 faces represent the 4 aspects of Christ, and they connect it with the 4 Gospels. It's obvious when you read the 4 Gospels that each Gospel had a different aspect of Christ. It said that Matthew's Gospel presents Christ as the King and Messiah, as represented by the lion. That Mark's Gospel presents Christ as the servant of them all, which is represented by the ox, which main function is to serve man. Luke's Gospel, it said, pictures Christ as every human, as the Son of Man. Therefore, the face of man would represent that aspect. And John's Gospel represents Jesus as a deity, as the Son of God, which is the soaring eagle that transcends over all. Now, this is how some of the church fathers understood these 4 faces. Whether they're right or wrong, we can't say. What they said is that as you look at Jesus from different angles, you see different aspects. Like you see different aspects of a diamond. But when you look at it at different angles, don't you see different parts of it? Each gospel portrays Jesus from a different aspect. One is king, one is servant, one is man, one is God. But another theory that I'm more inclined to go with is that these 4 faces represent aspects of God's nature himself. The lion represents his royalty. It represents really that he is just. You know, a king ruled in justice, right? He was the judge. The lion represents God's justice. The ox represented his power. God's an omnipotent God. The eagle represented his endless wisdom. And then man represented what was the apple of his eye, his love. We could go on and on and on. These are different theories and different beliefs that people felt that were represented by these four faces. It says here they had 4 wings, and with 2 of them they covered their bodies. With 2, they stretched out and touched the wings of others, and the 2 on the inside would cover their bodies. These 4 stood in a square formation, with 2 of their wings outstretched, touching the wingtips of others. The shape of the wings created a square, and upon this square was a platform, and it was supported by wheels. And there was 1 wheel by each of these 4 living creatures. For each creature there appears to be a wheel. The wheels support the platform, which, what was on the platform? The throne. So Ezekiel describes the creatures first, then the wheels and the platform, then the throne. He spends at least 10 verses describing the creatures. Among the other things he says about the creature, it says they went wherever the Spirit wanted them to go. They went straight forward. That doesn't mean that they always went the same direction. They didn't have to turn to go into another direction because they had faces looking in every direction. So whichever way they were going straight forward. They didn't have to pivot. They would just move at right angles without turning. It says that they went like lightning. Verse 13. They could go suddenly and quickly, since they were bearing upon them the throne of God. This would represent that God is governing and can move about at the speed of lightning at any position or place therein. That they can go wherever is required. There's no slowness about it. Nothing hinders God. He can go immediately at the trouble spot, and that He is always on the scene whenever His attention and sovereignty is needed to be expressed. In verses 15 to 25, we have a description of the chariot with the wheels. Dennis, read 15.
Now as I beheld the living creatures, behold, 1 wheel upon the earth by the living creatures with its 4 faces.
Now that sounds like 1 wheel, but as we read on, we see that there were 4 wheels, 1 by each of the creatures. Justin, read 16.
This was the appearance and the structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite in all 4 lobes of light. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting the wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not turn about as the creatures went.
Okay. Now, we're not talking about a circle with a circle inside of it. What we're talking about is a wheel like this and a wheel like this. Like that. All right, 90-degree angles. Meaning they could go. It kind of reminds me of a zero-turn lawnmower. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. All right, 17 and 18. Yes.
When they went upon the 4 sides, and they turned not when they went. As for their rings, they were so high that they were dreadful, and their rings were full of eyes, round about them full.
Why does the wheel need eyes on it? This is symbolic of God's ability to see and to know. Justin?
So is this where they come up with the idea of images, like the wheels, the eyes, and stuff?
His eyes are always upon everything that happens. He doesn't miss anything. This is where they get that from, yes. But God knows. He's omniscient. I can't say that very well, but you know what it is. All-knowing. Zechariah depicted a stone with 7 eyes on it, and these are carried over in Revelation chapter 5 to the Lamb. Remember, the Lamb had 7 horns, and he had 7 eyes. Remember that? Horns represent strength. Eyes represent knowledge. All power is in all knowledge. The wheels here face in every direction, and they're full of eyes, so in a sense, they can see in every direction. So this depicts that they can see in every direction and that He has all knowledge. All right, Justin 19 and 20.
When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels.
The Spirit was in the wheels probably means that the same Spirit of God that moved the living creatures was the same Spirit that was moving the wheels. It says in verse 12 that the creatures went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit went, they went. They were instantly responsive to the will of God's Spirit. Verse 21.
When those went, these went. And when those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up over against them. For the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels.
Okay, so again, the wheels went where the creatures went. Where the creatures went, the wheels went. Verse 22, read 22 through 25.
Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. Under the expanse their wings were stretched out, one toward the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings, like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then
Yeah, verse 25. Yeah, okay. Now, when it says the likeness of the firmament, in this case, the firmament is talking about the platform of the chariot. Okay? Now, what is being said here is kind of hard to understand. It's kind of difficult to imagine, but apparently these beasts or these creatures had their wings stretched out. 2 of them was covering them. 2 of them was touching each other. They were in a square formation. Each one was by a wheel. The idea is that God's chariot was attended by these creatures, and the wheels of the creatures were equipped to go in any direction. It went at lightning speed without turning. They could see everywhere, know everything, and that God's chariot had access to every point in the world, and God knew everything, and He could be there to attend to anything He desired. In other words, God's rulership is universal. That's what's primarily represented here. Now, I might add that the living creatures, which are not yet identified for us, they later appear in Ezekiel's second vision. In Ezekiel 10:15, we're given a different pieces of information. It says the cherubim were lifted up. This was the living creature I saw by the river Kibar. Here we're told that they're cherubim. We're not told that in chapter 1. Remember, the creature that Isaiah saw was called a seraphim. In Revelation, these creatures seem to be a combination. This gives us reason to question that these are they literal beings or are they symbolic? Now, let's look at verse 27. I'll read it. And above the firmament over the heads was the likeness of the throne in appearance like a sapphire stone. On the likeness of the throne was a likeness of the appearance of a man high above it. Now, he's not saying he saw these things. He saw what was like this and what was like that. Ezekiel never saw God. He saw things that were in the likeness of God. All right, verse 27. I think it's Dennis's turn.
And I saw the color of amber as the appearance of fire round about within it. From the appearance of his loins even upward, and from the appearance of his loins even downward. I saw as if it were the appearance of fire, and it had brightness round about.
Now, I don't know why he couldn't have just said the whole image was on fire. He said, from here up it's on fire, and from here down it's on fire. He could have just said it's all on fire. But notice that the little detail here. He spent 10 verses describing the creatures and the same amount describing the wheels of the chariots, but there was only one verse describing the one that was on the throne. Did you notice that? Why is that? Why so much detail on others and so little on the one who is God? Well, it's obvious that He's giving no justification for giving people a description in order to make an idol. gets all this detail, don't you think people would be reading it and making image of it and worshiping it? Of course. And remember, the Israelites had a problem with idolatry, so he wasn't about to give the full detail. All right, verse 28, our final verse.
Like the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so it was the radiance around me. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speak.
Now, just like Ezekiel, we just said we hear the appearance of a rainbow. In Revelation chapter 4, what was above the throne of God? A rainbow. Rainbow is a symbol of God's grace. Why is it a symbol of God's grace? Pastor, it's a symbol of God's promise. But why is it really a symbol of His grace? Because God sent a flood on the earth. And after that, He determined He would never again flood the earth. The rainbow was His covenant that He would not destroy the earth with a flood again. The same conditions that caused God to bring a flood still existed in man's heart after the flood. Despite that man's heart was not improved, because God made a promise and He extended His grace, He'll never flood the earth again. This is strictly a case of grace. He says this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. If you were a science man, you would look at this and you say, what we just described sounds like a UFO. And did you know that there have been really liberal scholars who tried to make points at what Ezekiel saw may have been a UFO? They've actually, scholars have said this. But Ezekiel told us what he saw. The very last thing he said was this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. It wasn't a UFO. And so when he saw this, what did he do? He fell on his face and he listened to the voice of the one who was speaking. Now we're finished. Next week we're going to do chapters 2 and 3. We might even get into chapter 4. I appreciate your indulgence tonight. We ended about 10 minutes over. But I wanted to finish this first chapter, with this being the intro. If you recall, when we did Isaiah, we spent 2 or 3 weeks on the introduction before we even started. But I was able to get this all into one lesson, the introduction in chapter 1. So hopefully we'll go through this at a good speed, and at least a slow enough speed to retain it, but fast enough to keep our interest in it. But it's an amazing book that I think we're going to thoroughly enjoy. So we're going to close with a word of prayer. We thank everybody for being here tonight. We appreciate Janet and Jesse for being here. We enjoyed your presence. We're going to call on Brother Justin to close us with prayer.
Dear Lord, thank you for being with us today, Lord, as we read your word. Lord, as we go further, and let's just gain knowledge and wisdom this summer.